The morning sun cut across the Coronado Naval Amphibious Base like a blade, throwing long shadows across Range Complex 7, where 47 SEAL snipers stood in rigid formation. The air tasted of salt and gun oil, carried in from the Pacific Ocean that whispered against the shore just beyond the berms, indifferent to what was about to happen on this May morning in 2019. At the far end of the range, exactly 3,200 meters distant, that's 1.988 miles, nearly 2 complete miles, a distance most people couldn't accurately judge with the naked eye. A steel silhouette target stood anchored into the California hillside. 40 inches tall, 20 inches wide, painted safety orange against the brown scrub. It might as well have been on the moon. Captain Kira Ashford stood at the firing line, dwarfed by the Barrett M82A1 rifle propped beside her on its bipod. The weapon was a monster, 32 pounds of machined steel and polymer, designed to punch holes through armored vehicles at distances that defied human comprehension. The barrel alone stretched 29 inches long, longer than her torso. She was 5 feet 2 inches tall in her combat boots and weighed 108 pounds, soaking wet. The rifle weighed nearly a third of her body weight. Commander Jack Harlan stood 10 feet away, arms crossed over his chest, his weathered face carved from granite and doubt. 61 years old with 34 years in the teams, he'd seen everything the world could throw at a warrior and survived it all. The scars on his neck, visible above his collar, were testament to that survival. Shrapnel wounds from Mogadishu, from a day in October 1993 when the world had tried very hard to kill him. He looked at Kira Ashford the way a man looks at a ghost he'd rather not see. "That gun weighs more than you do, Captain," he said, his voice carrying across the assembled snipers with the authority of 3 decades of command. "This isn't a science fair project." A ripple of laughter moved through the crowd of SEALs. Not cruel exactly, just skeptical. These were men who'd earned their place here through blood and sacrifice. They'd stacked bodies in Fallujah and Helmand Province. They'd made shots that changed the course of battles, that saved lives, that ended threats from distances that seemed to violate the laws of physics. And now they were being asked to watch a woman barely past her mid-20s, small enough to be mistaken for a teenager, attempt to break a record that had stood for 6 years. Kira didn't acknowledge the laughter. She ran her hand along the Barrett's receiver, checking the bolt action with practiced efficiency. Her fingers moved with the confidence of someone who'd done this 10,000 times, in 100 different conditions, under every kind of pressure except this exact moment. "Sir," she said, her voice calm as flat water, "my grandfather made a 2,100-meter shot in Korea with iron sights and a Springfield rifle. I have significantly better equipment." The laughter died immediately. Commander Harlan's jaw tightened, the muscles working beneath weathered skin. He knew exactly who her grandfather was. Gunnery Sergeant Nathaniel Brennan, Korean War legend, called Iron Eyes by the men who'd served with him. 127 confirmed kills, most of them at ranges that shouldn't have been possible with the technology of that era, made in conditions that would break lesser men. And Harlan knew who her father was too. That was the real problem, the weight that had been sitting on his chest for 26 years. He stepped closer, close enough that only Kira could hear his next words. "Your father said those exact same words before Mogadishu," Harlan said quietly, and something in his voice made the moment suddenly intimate, suddenly dangerous. "Then he made a shot that saved my life, and it killed him." Kira's hands stilled on the rifle for just a fraction of a second. Then she continued her pre-fire checks, as if he hadn't spoken, as if he hadn't just opened a door she'd been trying to walk through her entire adult life. "Load and make ready," Harlan said, stepping back, his voice returning to its command register. "You've got 3 shots. Make them count." But this wasn't how the story began. The record attempt was the destination, but the journey, the crucible that would forge Kira Ashford into something more than just another talented shooter. That journey had started 3 weeks earlier with a letter from a dead man and a secret buried for 26 years. The letter had arrived at Dam Neck, Virginia, delivered by Commander Harlan himself, in a scene that still played in Kira's mind with crystalline clarity. She'd been fresh off the Precision Marksman Initiative qualification, where she'd shot a perfect 10 for 10 at 1,000 meters with moving targets in a 15-knot crosswind. It was the best score the program had seen in 15 years, and it had earned her a spot in SEAL sniper training, the first woman to make it past the initial screening in the program's history. Harlan had arrived unannounced, carrying a military footlocker that looked like it had survived multiple wars. He'd set it on her bunk without ceremony, without explanation, and simply said, "Open it." Inside, wrapped in oilcloth that smelled of decades, was a rifle. Not the modern precision instruments she trained on, but something older, something with history carved into every inch of its stock and receiver. A Springfield M21, the sniper variant of the M14, the kind of rifle that had served in the early days of special operations, before the modern era of laser rangefinders and ballistic computers. The stock was scratched and worn, dark with the oils of 1,000 handling sessions. And there, near the cheek weld, were stains that could have been anything, but almost certainly weren't. They were the dark rust color of old blood. Beneath the rifle was a leather-bound data book, the kind snipers used to record every shot, every condition, every variable that might matter the next time they looked through a scope. The handwriting inside was precise, almost architectural in its exactness. And beneath the data book was a letter, sealed in a plastic bag to protect it from moisture and time. The envelope was addressed in that same precise handwriting, "To Captain Kira Ashford, if I don't come home." Her hands had trembled as she opened it. Not because she was weak. Kira Ashford had never been weak a day in her life, but because she was holding words written by a man she'd never met, a man who died when she was 6 months old, too young to remember his face or his voice or the way he'd held her. The letter was dated October 2nd, 1993, the night before everything went wrong in Mogadishu. The words were precise, measured, written by a man who knew he might not survive the next 48 hours and wanted to leave something behind for a daughter he'd barely known. "Kira," it began, "if you're reading this, it means I didn't make it back from this deployment. I'm sorry. I'm sorry I won't be there to see you grow up, to teach you to shoot the way my father taught me, to walk you down the aisle someday, or meet your children. I'm sorry for all the moments I'll miss." The letter continued with words that would reshape everything Kira thought she understood about her father, about service, about the weight of making choices that mattered. "But I'm not sorry for the choice I made to serve, and I hope someday you'll understand why. The longest shot isn't measured in meters or miles. It's choosing to serve, knowing you might not come home, knowing you might never meet your own daughter, knowing the cost and paying it anyway, because some things matter more than personal happiness." Her father's words painted a picture of a man who understood his purpose with brutal clarity, who knew the risks and accepted them as the price of doing something that mattered. I've made a lot of shots in my career. Some of them mattered, some of them didn't. The one I'm about to make tomorrow, if the mission happens the way I think it will, that one will matter. It will save lives. Good men will go home to their families because of it. And if it costs me my life, that's a trade I'll make without hesitation. Then came the part that would change everything. The information that had been classified for 26 years and was now being passed from father to daughter across the Gulf of Death. "Tell Commander Harlan the coordinates, 33, 5 degrees north, 45.3 degrees east. He'll understand what they mean. He'll know why I'm giving them to you. The shot they'll never record saved 12 men. Tell him it wasn't his fault. Tell him to stop carrying it." The letter ended with words that Kira would come to understand only after she'd walked through fire herself. "Be precise in your choices, little warrior. Precision isn't in the trigger finger, it's in the heart. It's knowing what matters and what doesn't. It's understanding that some shots you take and some shots you refuse. And knowing the difference is what makes you a warrior instead of just someone with a rifle. I love you. I'll always love you, even from wherever I end up. Your father, Master Chief William Iron Ashford. Kira had read the letter 3 times before she could speak. When she finally looked up, Commander Harlan was standing at the window, his back to her, shoulders tight with tension that had nothing to do with military bearing and everything to do with carrying 26 years of guilt. "The coordinates," Kira said, her voice rough. "What do they mean?" Harlan didn't turn around. "They're the exact position where your father died. October 4th, 1993, Mogadishu, Somalia, 2.87 kilometers from his shooting position to the target he engaged." He paused, and the silence stretched like a wound opening. "They're also the location where a United States Army helicopter gunner mistakenly engaged what he thought was an enemy position. Friendly fire. Blue on blue. Your father was killed by our own forces." The words hung in the air like smoke from a discharge, acrid and impossible to ignore. "The Pentagon classified the incident," Harlan continued, still not looking at her. "Operational security," they said. "Political sensitivity with the Pakistanis in the UN mission. But the real reason was simpler. They didn't want anyone asking questions about how a SEAL sniper ended up dead from American bullets after making the longest confirmed kill in naval special warfare history." He finally turned to face her. His eyes were haunted, carrying weight that had nothing to do with the years on his calendar and everything to do with the ghost he'd been living with. "Your father made a 2,847-meter shot under combat conditions," Harlan said, and his voice carried the weight of truth that had been buried too long. "He saved 12 lives, 8 U.S. Rangers and 4 Pakistani peacekeepers who were about to be overrun by militia fighters with a technical mounted .50 caliber. He made that shot through smoke and dust in chaos, with rounds impacting around his position, knowing it would give away his location." Harlan's hands clenched into fists at his sides, the only visible sign of the emotion roiling beneath his professional exterior. And 90 seconds later, he was dead. The helicopter gunner saw his muzzle flash, thought it was enemy fire, engaged with the door gun. Your father never had a chance. Kira felt something cold settle in her chest. Something that had been there her whole life, but never had a name until this moment. It wasn't grief. She'd never known him well enough to grieve in the traditional sense. It was something else. Recognition, maybe. Understanding why her mother had always looked so sad when people called her father a hero. Why there had always been something unspoken in the way she talked about his death. "Why are you telling me this now?" Kira asked, forcing the words past the tightness in her throat. "Because you're about to attempt 3,200 meters, Harlan said. "You're about to try to break the official SEAL record. And when you do, if you do, the Pentagon won't be able to keep your father's shot classified anymore. They can't have a new record holder without acknowledging the old one. You'll force their hand. You'll make them tell the truth about what really happened in Mogadishu." He pulled a folder from inside his jacket, set it on the footlocker next to the rifle. Classified stamps covered the cover, but they'd been crossed out with red marker, and the word "leaked" was written across the top in aggressive handwriting that suggested anger barely contained. "Master Chief Lucas Barrett leaked this to me 3 days ago," Harlan said. "He thinks you deserve to know the truth before you make your attempt. He thinks the teams deserve to know what your father really accomplished, what he really sacrificed." Kira opened the folder with hands that wanted to shake. Inside was a Pentagon after-action report, heavily redacted, but still readable in the parts that mattered. Confirmation of the 2,847-meter shot. Confirmation of the 12 lives saved. Confirmation of the cause of death. Friendly fire from U.S. forces. Helicopter door gunner. Misidentification of friendly position due to combat conditions and poor visibility. And at the bottom, a note in different handwriting written with a kind of angry precision that suggested someone had been waiting years to write these exact words. Real SEAL record, classified for political expedience. William Ashford deserves recognition. Use this however you see fit. The teams deserve to know their history, not the sanitized version Pentagon wants them to remember. He's giving you a choice, Harlan said quietly, and there was something in his voice that suggested he understood the weight of what he was asking. You can make your record attempt and say nothing. Let the bureaucrats handle it however they want. Or you can make your attempt and tell the world what really happened to your father. Force the truth into the light where it belongs. Either way, you need to understand what you're chasing isn't just a number on a scoreboard. It's his ghost. And ghosts have a way of pulling you down with them if you're not careful. Kira closed the folder, set it aside with deliberate care, and picked up her father's rifle. It was heavier than she expected, not because of its physical weight, but because of everything it carried with it. History, legacy, the weight of choices made a generation ago that were still echoing through her life like ripples from a stone thrown into still water. "Did you know him well?" she asked, and the question came out softer than she'd intended, more vulnerable. "I was his spotter for 18 months, Harlan said, and something in his voice shifted, became less commander and more man. Somalia was our third deployment together. We ran operations out of Mogadishu for 6 months before October 3rd. He taught me more about patience and precision in that time than I'd learned in the previous 10 years in the teams. He had this way of reading conditions that I've never seen in anyone else, before or since. Could look at grass bending or dust moving or mirage shimmer and tell you exactly what the wind was doing at every point between him and the target." Harlan moved to the window again, staring out at the Virginia landscape that looked nothing like the Mogadishu streets where he'd left part of himself 26 years ago. October 3rd was the famous battle. Black Hawk down. The Rangers in Delta got hit hard in the city, and we were on overwatch from a building on the perimeter. We were there for 14 hours straight, providing covering fire for the extraction. Your father made 18 confirmed kills that day, 18 shots that mattered. 18 times he put a bullet exactly where it needed to be to save somebody's life. His voice went distant, traveling back through time to a day that clearly still lived with him in vivid, painful detail. Late in the afternoon, an RPG hit our position. Should have killed us both. I saw it coming maybe half a second before impact, just enough time to recognize we were about to die, but not enough time to do anything about it. But your father grabbed me and threw me toward the stairwell, put his body between me and the blast, took shrapnel that was meant for me, saved my life for the first time that day. Harlan touched the scars on his neck unconsciously, fingers tracing the evidence of violence survived. I got medevaced out that night, spent 2 days in the field hospital getting patched up, getting metal pulled out of my neck and shoulder. Your father stayed on station despite being wounded, had shrapnel in his back, in his legs, but he refused extraction. Said the mission wasn't complete, said there were still people who needed covering fire. The pause that followed was heavy with the weight of what came next. October 4th, when the call came for the quick reaction force, when they needed snipers to provide overwatch for the rescue operation, to go back in and pull out bodies and survivors, your father volunteered. I tried to stop him from my hospital bed, called him on the radio, told him he was wounded, told him he'd done enough, told him to let someone else handle it. You know what he said? Kira shook her head, not trusting her voice, feeling the tears starting but refusing to let them fall. He said, "Some shots matter more than others, Stone. Tomorrow's shot matters. I can feel it. This is what I'm here for." And then he went anyway, despite being injured, despite my protests, despite everything that made sense, because he understood something most people never figure out. He understood his purpose. Harlan's voice broke slightly, the first crack in the professional armor he wore like a second skin. He made that 28-47-meter shot through smoke and dust in chaos. Pakistani peacekeepers were getting massacred by a technical with a mounted .50 caliber. Militia fighters were going to overrun their position, kill them all. Your father engaged from almost 2 miles away through conditions that should have made the shot physically impossible. One round through the windshield killed the driver. The truck crashed into a wall. 12 men lived because of that shot. 12 men who went home to their families, who got to see their children grow up, who got to live the lives your father gave them. The silence that followed was absolute, the kind of quiet that feels like the world holding its breath. And 90 seconds later, Harlan continued, his voice barely above a whisper now, rough with suppressed emotion. A U.S. Army helicopter came around for another pass. Door gunner saw the muzzle flash from your father's position, saw smoke and movement, thought it was enemy combatants, engaged with the .50 caliber. I heard it on the radio from the hospital, heard your father's position getting hit, heard the gunfire, couldn't do anything, couldn't save him the way he'd saved me twice in 2 days. Tears were running down Harlan's weathered cheeks now, cutting tracks through decades of suppressed grief and guilt that had never found proper outlet. His last words on the radio were for you. I heard them clear as anything. Tell Kira precision is patient. She'll understand when she's ready. And then the transmission went dead. Just static. And I knew he was gone. Kira felt her own tears starting, hot and unexpected, the kind of crying that comes from a place deeper than conscious thought. She was crying for a man she'd never known, for a father who existed only in photographs and other people's memories, for the weight of understanding that he'd chosen to leave her before she was old enough to remember him, because he believed something was more important than being her father. You've been carrying that for 26 years, she said, and it wasn't a question. Every single day, Harlan confirmed, his voice raw and honest in a way that suggested this was the first time he'd said these words out loud, the first time he'd let someone see the weight he'd been carrying alone for more than 2 decades. The guilt of surviving when he didn't, the burden of knowing I was supposed to tell you something and not understanding what it meant, the weight of watching the Pentagon classify his shot, bury his sacrifice in some filing cabinet somewhere, all because they didn't want difficult questions about friendly fire and operational mistakes, and the price we pay for fighting wars in places where the lines aren't clear. He looked directly at her, and in his eyes, Kira could see the accumulated weight of years spent wrestling with survivor's guilt and unanswered questions. That's why I didn't want you in this program, Ashford. Not because you're not capable. You're more capable than most of the men I've trained. Not because you're a woman. I stopped caring about that the first time I watched you shoot. Because you are exactly as capable as your father was. You have his gift, his talent, his ability to make impossible shots look routine. And I watched capability get him killed. I watched command use his talent until there was nothing left to use. And I couldn't bear the thought of watching it happen again. Couldn't stand the idea of training another Ashford to be so good at this job that they become indispensable, that they get sent on missions nobody else can handle until eventually the odds catch up. Kira stepped closer, close enough to see every line etched into his face by years of service and sacrifice, close enough to see the pain he'd been living with for longer than she'd been alive. My father made a choice, sir, she said, and her voice was steady despite the tears, firm despite the emotion threatening to overwhelm her. He chose to take that mission knowing the risks. He chose to make that shot knowing it would expose his position. He died doing what he believed mattered more than his own safety, more than coming home to his daughter. And yes, it cost him his life. It cost me a father I never got to know, never got to learn from, never got to disappoint or make proud or have any kind of relationship with. But it saved 12 men who went home to their families. 12 fathers who got to raise their children. 12 husbands who got to grow old with their wives. She took a breath, steadying herself against the wave of emotion. I'm not here to repeat his story, Commander. I'm not trying to die young and leave behind grieving family members. I'm here to understand what he understood, to figure out what he knew that made that choice worth making, to learn what it means to be precise, not just in shooting, but in purpose. And tomorrow, when I attempt 3,200 meters, I'm not chasing his ghost. I'm honoring his understanding that precision is about more than accuracy, more than hitting targets. It's about knowing what matters and what doesn't. It's about making choices that serve something larger than yourself. Harlan stared at her for a long moment, and Kira could see him wrestling with something internal, some battle between his duty as an instructor and his guilt as a man who'd survived when his partner hadn't. His fear of losing another Ashford, and his recognition that she had every right to walk the path her father had walked. Finally, he sighed and suddenly looked every one of his 61 years, the weight of command and memory and loss written in the lines of his face. Get some rest, Captain. Tomorrow's going to be the longest day of your life. And if you make this shot, when you make this shot, everything changes. For you, for the teams, for your father's memory. Make sure you're ready for that. That night, Kira lay in her rack staring at the ceiling, holding her father's letter, trying to understand a man she'd never met through the words he'd written the night before he died. She thought about the weight of legacy, about carrying a name that came with expectations and history, and the ghosts of men who'd made impossible shots in impossible circumstances. But mostly she thought about what her father had meant when he wrote that precision is patient, that it wasn't about shooting at all. It was about life, about making decisions with care, about waiting for the right moment instead of forcing action when the time wasn't right, about understanding that some choices mattered more than others, and knowing the difference was what separated warriors from killers, service from violence. She finally understood, and understanding changed everything. Coronado in late April was a different world than Virginia in winter. The sun was brutal, climbing into the sky each morning like a hammer looking for something to strike. The ranges stretched out across scrubland that shimmered with heat distortion by 10 in the morning, making targets dance and waver like mirages born from superheated air. The SEAL snipers who populated the training compound moved with the casual confidence of men who'd earned their quiet presence through blood and sacrifice in a dozen countries most Americans couldn't find on a map. Kira arrived with her sea bag and her rifle case, and a determination that felt like armor wrapped around her chest. The barracks were Spartan in a way that spoke to military efficiency, stripped of all pretense. 20 bunks arranged in 2 rows, foot lockers at the end of each rack, one shared head that smelled perpetually of industrial cleaner and masculine proximity. The scent of gun oil and boot polish hung in the air like incense in a church dedicated to the religion of precision violence. She got the bunk nearest the door, the one nobody wanted because people slammed in and out at all hours, because it was furthest from the head, because it caught every draft when the door opened. She didn't complain, just made her rack with hospital corners tight enough to bounce a quarter, stowed her gear with the same meticulous attention to detail she brought to everything, and reported for the first briefing at 0500 hours, 15 minutes early. Commander Jack Harlan looked at her the way a man looks at a problem he doesn't want to solve but knows he can't avoid. The briefing room was filled with 22 other candidates, all male, all carrying themselves with the quiet confidence of men who'd already proven themselves in combat. Some had ranger tabs on their uniforms. Some had force recon backgrounds visible in the way they moved. All of them had killed men in close quarters and at distance, had made shots that mattered under conditions that would break civilian comprehension. And all of them were staring at the woman who just walked into their world. Harlan stood at the front of the room, arms crossed over his chest, his weathered face giving away nothing. But Kira could see the calculation happening behind his eyes, could sense him measuring her against the ghost of her father, against the weight of 26 years of guilt and memory. "Captain Ashford," he said, his voice carrying across the assembled class with the authority of 3 decades in the teams. I understand you shot perfect at Dam Neck. Yes, sir. That's impressive. Means you can hit targets under controlled conditions with known distances and predictable wind patterns. He paused, letting the silence build like pressure in a vessel. This program isn't about controlled conditions. This is about hitting targets when you're tired, cold, wet, scared, and someone's shooting back at you. When the distance isn't known and the wind keeps changing and you've been awake for 36 hours and your spotter just took a round, you think you can handle that? Yes, sir. We'll see. Harlan's eyes swept across the entire class, making contact with each candidate, letting them feel the weight of what they were about to attempt. First evolution starts at 0600, 12-mile ruck march, full combat load, 3-hour time limit. Fall behind, you're out. Medical drop, you're out. Quit, and you're definitely out. Questions? No one spoke. The room held its breath, 23 warriors waiting for what came next. Outstanding. Get your gear and be on the parade ground in 30 minutes. The other candidates filtered out, their boots heavy on the deck, their conversations quiet and focused on the challenge ahead. Kira moved to follow, but Harlan's voice stopped her like a physical barrier. Ashford, a word. She turned back, came to attention with the precision drilled into her through years of service. Sir, Harlan waited until they were alone, until the operations center was empty except for the two of them and the ghosts they both carried, until the silence became heavy enough to force honesty. I knew your father, he said finally, the words coming out like they'd been locked behind his teeth for years and were only now forcing their way into the light. I know, sir. Master Chief Barrett told me. Did he tell you I was his spotter? That we ran missions together for 18 months? That I was there when he died? Yes, sir. Harlan's jaw worked like he was chewing something bitter, something that had been sitting in his mouth for 2.5 decades and still tasted like ashes. He moved to the window, staring out at the ranges that stretched toward the ocean, at the targets that stood like sentinels in the distance, marking the difference between competence and excellence. Your father was the best sniper I ever worked with, he said quietly, and there was no pride in his voice, only the weight of loss. Best I've seen before or since. He had a gift. Same gift you apparently inherited based on your Dam Neck scores. He could read conditions other people couldn't even perceive. Made shots that shouldn't have been possible with the equipment we had then, under circumstances that would make most shooters pack up and go home. He turned to face her, and the weight in his eyes was almost physical, pressing down like atmosphere at depth. I'm not complimenting you. I'm telling you why I don't want you in my program. Kira blinked, the only outward sign of her surprise. Sir? I watched your father die because he was too good, Harlan said, and his voice carried the kind of raw honesty that only comes when a man has nothing left to lose by telling the truth. Because command kept sending him on missions that required his particular gift. Because the teams needed him to make the impossible shots that nobody else could make. So they kept putting him in positions where he had to perform miracles under fire. And eventually, inevitably, the odds caught up. They always do. He took a step closer, and Kira could see the lines of pain etched into his face, the scars that weren't visible, but were no less real than the shrapnel wounds on his neck. He died serving his country, yes. Nobody disputes that. He's a hero, they say, but he also died at 34 years old, leaving behind a 6-month-old daughter who grew up without a father, who never got to know the man who gave her his talent and his name. You think I want to watch that happen again? You think I want to train you, send you downrange, and someday have to explain to your children, if you live long enough to have children, why their mother didn't come home? Why she died making a shot that command needed because nobody else was good enough. Kira stood straighter, her spine rigid with the kind of discipline that had been drilled into her through years of service and sacrifice. Permission to speak freely, sir. Denied. I'm not done. Harlan's voice hardened. taking on the edge of command that had led men through combat for 3 decades. Your father died because he was exceptionally skilled at killing people from a long way off. That's the job. That's what we train you to do. Excel at this, become the best, and you're going to get sent to places where people are trying very hard to kill you back. People who are also good at what they do, who have their own skills in training and motivation. And you know what the difference is between you and every man in this compound? He didn't wait for her to answer. They're bigger, stronger, faster. They can carry more gear, hump longer distances, take more damage and keep fighting. You might be the best shot I've ever seen, and your damn neck scores suggest you might be. But if you get wounded and need to be carried 3 miles to an extraction point, you become a liability. This isn't about equality or fairness or proving something to skeptics. This is about mission success and bringing everyone home alive. And I have to ask myself if your presence makes that mission more or less likely to succeed. Kira held his gaze without flinching, without letting the words penetrate the armor she'd built around herself. Then I'll make sure I don't miss, sir. I'll make sure I'm so good that I never get into a position where I'm the one being carried out. Harlan shook his head, and something in the gesture looked almost sad, almost paternal. You sound exactly like him. Those exact words. I'll make sure I don't miss, Stone. I'll be so good they'll never have a reason to doubt. That's what scares me more than anything else you could have said, because I watched what happened when he lived up to that promise. I watched what it cost him. My father died doing what he was born to do, sir, Kira said, and her voice was steady as bedrock, firm as the foundation of everything she believed. I'm not here to be safe. I'm not here to avoid risk or live a long, comfortable life in some career that doesn't matter. I'm here to be worthy of carrying his name. And if that means I take the same risks he took, face the same dangers he faced, then that's what it means. I accept that cost. For a long moment, Harlan just stared at her, and Kira could see him wrestling with something internal, some battle between his duty as an instructor and his guilt as a man who'd survived when his partner hadn't, his fear of losing another Ashford, and his recognition that she had every right to walk this path. Finally, he sighed and suddenly looked every one of his 61 years, the weight of command and memory settling visibly onto his shoulders. Get your ruck, Captain. You've got 28 minutes until formation. Yes, sir. She was halfway to the door when he spoke again, his voice quieter now, carrying weight that had nothing to do with command authority and everything to do with memory and loss. Ashford. Sir, your father's last words to me on that radio in Mogadishu, right before the helicopter came around and everything went to hell, he said, "Tell my daughter Precision is patient. She'll understand when she's ready." Harlan's voice was rough, with emotion barely contained. I never understood what he meant. Maybe you will. Maybe that's why you're here. Kira felt something crack in her chest, some barrier between her and the understanding of what her father had been trying to tell her across the years and the distance of death. Thank you, sir, for carrying that message, for keeping it safe until I was ready to hear it. She made the ruck march in 2 hours and 47 minutes, finishing solidly in the middle of the pack. Not fast enough to draw attention as someone trying to prove something, not slow enough to raise concerns about her physical capability, good enough to pass. That was the pattern she established over the first 3 weeks. Competent but not exceptional in the physical evolutions. Exceptional but not showy in the shooting disciplines. She qualified expert on every weapon system they put in her hands. The M4 carbine with its close quarters versatility. The MK-18 shortened rifle for vehicle work. The M110 semi-automatic sniper system for sustained fire. The bolt-action precision rifles that were the bread and butter of long-range work. Each qualification she approached with the same methodical precision, treating every shot like it was the only one that mattered, building a reputation for consistency and competence. But it was in the small moments, the quiet acts of sabotage that started in week 2, that she began to understand what this was really about. Her rangefinder went missing before a long-distance shoot. She found it later that day, buried in her footlocker under her spare uniforms, placed there by hands that knew exactly what they were doing and wanted to send a message. Her scope was mysteriously bumped out of zero between the evening cleaning session and the morning qualification, requiring a complete recalibration that would eat into her preparation time. Her ammunition got switched, 168-grain bullets instead of her carefully loaded 190-grain rounds, just different enough to throw her calculations off by inches at distance. Small things, deniable things, things that could be explained away as accidents or oversights if anyone bothered to investigate, which no one did because this was SEAL training, and a certain amount of harassment was expected, even encouraged as a way of testing mental toughness and adaptability. Kira said nothing. She adapted. The day her scope was knocked out of zero, she showed up to the range and ran the recalibration drill in 8 minutes flat, her hands moving with practiced efficiency born from thousands of repetitions. Then she shot a perfect group at 800 meters using nothing but Kentucky windage, the old-school technique of holdover and hold-off without adjusting the scope at all. Just reading the wind, calculating the drop, understanding the ballistics so thoroughly that she could compensate in her mind and hold the crosshairs exactly where they needed to be. The day her ammunition was switched, she noticed before loading her rifle. Picked up a round, felt the weight difference in her palm, just a few grains but enough for someone with her sensitivity, and knew immediately something was wrong. She ran quick calculations in her head for the different bullet weight and trajectory. 168 grain dropping faster, drifting more in the wind, arriving at the target with different energy. She adjusted her aim accordingly, compensating for variables she hadn't planned for. 5 shots at 1,000 meters, all within a 4-inch circle, using ammunition she'd never fired before from that particular rifle. Petty Officer Colt Brennan watched this with narrowing eyes, his jaw tight with something that might have been respect, or might have been frustration, or might have been both. He was 32 years old, 6'1", with the kind of lean, weathered build that came from a decade of deployments to the worst places on Earth. 180 confirmed kills across Afghanistan and Iraq, each one recorded in a data book that read like a catalog of human violence. A Purple Heart from a firefight in Fallujah, where he'd taken shrapnel to the leg and kept shooting until the position was secure, until his teammates were safe, until the mission was complete. He was also the unofficial leader of a group of 4 SEAL snipers who'd taken it upon themselves to make Kira's life difficult. Not dangerous. They weren't trying to get her killed or seriously injured, just difficult enough to see if she'd crack under pressure, if she'd complain, if she'd prove herself to be someone who needed special accommodation or protection. On the evening of week 3, he found her in the cleaning shed, field stripping her rifle with the kind of meditative focus some people brought to prayer or meditation. The shed smelled of CLP and carbon fouling, of metal and oil, and the particular scent that came from weapons that had been fired thousands of times and meticulously maintained after each use. "You knew," he said without preamble, leaning against the doorframe with his arms crossed over his chest. Kira looked up from the bolt carrier group she was scrubbing, her hands black with carbon residue. "Petty Officer Brennan, you knew someone was screwing with your gear," he continued, pushing off the frame and walking into the shed with the deliberate pace of someone who'd made a decision and was going to see it through. "You knew it was us." She returned to cleaning the bolt, her hands steady despite the accusation. "If I'd known it was you, Petty Officer, I would have reported it to the senior instructor. That's proper protocol for equipment sabotage." "Bullshit." Brennan sat down on the bench across from her, close enough that she could see the scar tissue on his hands from burns and cuts, and the 1,000 small injuries that came from a career handling weapons and explosives. "You knew, and you didn't say anything because you wanted to prove you could adapt. Wanted to show us you weren't going to cry foul at the first sign of adversity, that you could take what we dished out and come back stronger. Kira set down the bolt and met his eyes directly, letting him see that she wasn't intimidated or angry or anything except professionally focused. Is there something I can help you with, petty officer? Brennan was quiet for a long moment, studying her with the kind of assessment that came from years of evaluating threats and allies in hostile environments, of making life or death decisions based on reading people's intentions and capabilities. Finally, he spoke. Why are you here? Same reason you are, to become a better shooter. No, he shook his head, leaning forward with his elbows on his knees. You're already a better shooter than half the guys in this compound. Your damn neck scores prove that. You don't need this program to teach you how to hit targets. So why are you really here? What are you trying to prove, and to who? Kira considered lying, considered deflecting with another professional non-answer that would maintain the barriers between them. Instead, she told him the truth, or at least part of it, because something in his question deserved honesty in return. My father died in Mogadishu when I was 6 months old, she said quietly, her voice losing some of its professional edge and becoming more human, more vulnerable. I never knew him, never heard his voice except in videos other people took, never felt him hold me, never got a single memory of what he was like as a person beyond what other people tell me and what I can piece together from his service record. She picked up a cleaning patch and ran it through the barrel with slow, deliberate movements, the motion automatic and soothing. For 26 years, I didn't understand why he made the choices he made, why being a SEAL mattered more than being my father, why making impossible shots under impossible conditions was worth dying for and leaving me to grow up without him. Brennan leaned forward, listening now with the kind of attention most people couldn't maintain, the focus that came from recognizing something genuine and important. Then I joined the Marines and picked up a rifle and discovered I had his gift, Kira continued, and there was something almost wonder in her voice, as if she still couldn't quite believe it herself. The same ability to read wind and distance and make calculations that other people couldn't see, couldn't understand. And I realized it wasn't just about shooting, it was about discipline, control, making the right decision at the right time for the right reason, understanding what matters and what doesn't. She looked up at Brennan, and he could see the depth of purpose in her eyes. Precision isn't just about where the bullet goes. It's about when you pull the trigger and when you don't. It's about understanding what your skills are for, what they serve. My father understood that. He died making a shot that saved 12 lives. That was his choice, his purpose. And I'm here to understand what he knew, to figure out what made that shot worth his life, to learn what it means to be precise, not just in shooting, but in purpose. Brennan nodded slowly, something in his expression shifting from skepticism to understanding. Okay, I can respect that. That's a better answer than I expected. Does that mean you and your friends will stop sabotaging my gear? He grinned, the expression transforming his face from hard professional to something almost boyish, almost friendly. Probably not. But now, when we do it, it won't be about you being a woman trying to prove something in a man's world. It'll be about you being competition, about seeing if you can handle what we throw at you and come back stronger. That's different. I can live with that. Good. Brennan stood, stretched his back with the kind of careful movement that suggested old injuries that never quite healed right. One more thing, Ashford. That 800-meter cold-bore shot you made yesterday with the Nox scope. I watched you calculate the holdover in about 3 seconds, then put the round exactly where you called it. That was some savant-level shooting, world-class stuff. Thank you. I wasn't complimenting you, I was warning you. His voice went serious again, losing the friendly edge and becoming the voice of someone who'd learned hard lessons and was trying to pass them on. You shoot like that in the field, people are going to come to depend on you. They're going to expect you to make the impossible shots every single time. Every mission, Every engagement, they'll look to you to solve problems with precision fire. And the problem with being the person who can make impossible shots is that eventually someone's going to ask you to make one when you shouldn't. When the conditions are wrong, the angle's bad, the wind's fucked, and the target is using civilians as shields. And if you take that shot because someone's depending on you and you miss, someone innocent might die. Or if you take it and hit, but the conditions were so bad it was mostly luck, you'll know you got away with something you shouldn't have tried. Kira's hands stilled on the rifle, the weight of his words settling into her understanding. So what do I do? You learn the hardest lesson there is for someone with your talent, Brennan said, and his voice carried the weight of hard experience. You learn to know when not to take the shot, when to tell your team leader no, the conditions aren't right, we need to wait or find another solution, or accept that this particular target can't be engaged right now. That's the difference between a good shooter and a great one. A good shooter makes the shot when asked. A great one knows when to refuse, when to wait, when to find another way. He left her alone with that thought, and the smell of gun solvent, and the weight of understanding that was beginning to settle into her bones, like calcium building stronger structure, making her more than she'd been before. Week 5 brought the desert, and with it the test that would define everything that came after. The Chocolate Mountains in Imperial County, California. Miles and miles of nothing stretching in every direction. Sand and rock and scrub brush and heat that could kill you if you weren't careful about hydration and sun exposure, and the 1,000 small decisions that separated survival from becoming another statistic in the unforgiving calculus of desert warfare. Daytime temperatures topping 115 degrees Fahrenheit, hot enough to cook flesh against metal, hot enough to make breathing feel like inhaling from an oven. Nighttime lows dropping to the mid-40s, a 70-degree temperature swing that would test equipment and human endurance in equal measure. The exercise was simple in concept, brutal in execution. 72 hours of survival, evasion, and precision shooting. Each sniper was given an M40A6 rifle, 20 rounds of match-grade ammunition, 3 days of water in camelback bladders, enough MREs to sustain minimum caloric intake, a ghillie suit that would blend with the desert terrain, map, compass, and a PRC-152 emergency radio sealed with tamper-evident tape that would record if it was open for anything other than genuine emergency. The mission was to locate and neutralize 3 targets spread across 50 square miles of desert wasteland. The targets were tactical mannequins positioned at unknown distances between 800 and 1,600 meters, placed to blend with the terrain, visible only to someone who knew how to read the landscape and look for anomalies in the natural patterns. Each target was scored by an observer with a spotting scope and high-speed camera setup that could track bullet impact with precision, recording not just hits and misses, but the quality of the shot, the conditions under which it was made. The rules were equally simple and equally brutal. You could use the radio for genuine emergencies only, medical situations, life-threatening injuries, catastrophic equipment failure that put you in immediate danger. Using it for anything less than immediate threat of death or permanent disability meant automatic disqualification. Failing to hit all 3 targets within the 72-hour window meant automatic disqualification. There were no exceptions, no appeals, no second chances. This was SEAL training, and SEAL training didn't believe in mercy or accommodation. It was designed to break people, to separate those who could endure from those who couldn't, to identify the candidates who had the mental fortitude to operate alone in hostile terrain with no support, no backup, no safety net except their own skill and determination and will to complete the mission regardless of cost. Kira moved through the desert like a ghost made flesh, like something that belonged to the landscape rather than imposing itself upon it. She understood from the first hour that this wasn't about speed or aggression or forcing outcomes. It was about patience and conservation and making every decision count, Understanding that in the desert, every choice had consequences, and mistakes compounded until they became fatal. First principle was heat management. She traveled only during early morning and late evening, when the sun sat low on the horizon and the temperatures dropped from lethal to merely brutal. During the midday hours, when the desert became a convection oven that could kill through heat stroke and dehydration, she found shade under rock overhangs, in the shadow of larger boulders, anywhere that offered protection from the sun that beat down like physical punishment, like the desert was actively trying to kill her through sheer thermal mass. Second principle was water discipline. She rationed her supply with mathematical precision, knowing exactly how much she needed to maintain cognitive function and physical capability without waste. The human body could survive days without food, but cognitive function degraded rapidly without proper hydration, and shooting at extreme distance required cognitive function operating at peak efficiency. Every calculation, every wind call, every range estimation depended on her brain working at full capacity. Third principle was patience. She spent hours glassing the terrain through her scope, searching for the mannequin targets that had been positioned to blend with the environment, to look like natural features until you understood what to look for. She didn't rush, didn't panic when the first day passed, and she'd only located one target. Time was a resource, same as water and ammunition, and she managed it with the same careful discipline her father had taught her through example, even though he'd never been there to teach her directly. Target 1 came on day 1 at 1900 hours, just as the sun was painting the western sky in shades of orange and purple that would have been beautiful if Kira had any attention to spare for aesthetics. Distance of 1,247 meters, according to her rangefinder. Wind at 8 knots from the west, steady and consistent in a way that was almost a gift. Temperature 89 degrees and dropping fast as the sun set, which meant the air density was changing, which meant her ballistic calculations needed to account for that shift. She waited 30 minutes for the mirage to calm, for the heat shimmer to stop dancing across the desert floor as the ground released the day's accumulated thermal energy. Patience. Precision. Understanding that the shot would be there when conditions were right, that forcing it before the moment arrived would only waste ammunition and possibly alert observers to her position before she was ready. Then she made the shot. The rifle cracked, the sound sharp and clean in the desert evening. 1,247 meters away, the mannequin sensor registered impact. Center mass. Perfect score. 1 target down, 2 to go. Target 2 came on day 2 at 0630 hours, just after sunrise when the air was still cool and stable, before the day's heat began to build and complicate the ballistics. Distance of 1,612 meters, the longest shot she'd ever attempted under field conditions, pushing the limits of what the M40A6 was designed to do. Wind variable between 5 and 12 knots, shifting directions like it couldn't make up its mind, like the desert itself was testing her ability to read conditions and adapt. Temperature 74 degrees and climbing steadily as the sun rose higher. Mirage already starting to dance across the desert floor as the ground warmed and created convection currents that would make the target appear to shift and waver. She spent 90 minutes watching the wind, learning its pattern, discovering that it cycled approximately every 11 minutes through a predictable sequence. The desert wind wasn't random. Nothing in nature was truly random if you watched long enough to understand the patterns. When the cycle hit its calm phase, when the flags of dust and debris settled and the air moved with consistent predictability, she took the shot. High right shoulder, still within the scoring zone, not perfect like the first shot, but good enough. 2 targets down, 1 to go. Target 3 came on day 2 at 1430 hours, and that's when everything changed. When the exercise stopped being about shooting and became about something much more important. Kira had been stalking toward the suspected location of the third target for 3 hours, moving slow and low through terrain that offered minimal cover, using every scrap of concealment the desert provided. The heat was crushing. 112 degrees according to the thermometer on her watch. The kind of heat that made thinking difficult and breathing feel like work, that tested the limits of human endurance. Then she saw him. Colt Brennan, 200 meters to her right, also moving toward what was obviously the same target location. Two shooters, one target. Whoever engaged first would complete the exercise and pass this evolution. She went prone immediately, became part of the desert floor, and glassed ahead with her scope. There, at 1,443 meters, the third mannequin positioned on a small rise, visible from both her location and Brennan's. One target, two shooters. A competition that would determine who passed and who failed. Kira was in position, had her rifle set up, had range calculated, had wind conditions assessed. Brennan was still moving, hadn't set up yet, was at least 5 minutes away from being ready to shoot. She could take the shot right now, claim the target, complete her mission, pass the test, prove she belonged here. She settled behind the rifle, her body moving through the familiar motions with practiced efficiency. Check the conditions one more time. Wind at 15 knots from the northeast, gusting to 18. Temperature 107 degrees. Heat shimmer making the target dance like a hallucination, like something that wasn't quite real. The conditions were barely acceptable for a shot at this distance. The gusting wind made precise calculations nearly impossible. She'd have to average the gusts and hope she timed the trigger press right. The mirage was severe enough that the target's apparent position might be off by several inches from its actual location. She could take the shot, probably had a 60% chance of hitting, maybe better if she timed the wind right. 60% was acceptable under combat conditions, good enough when lives were on the line and you had to engage regardless of conditions. But there was another option. She could wait. Wait for the conditions to improve, for the wind to settle, for the mirage to calm as evening approached. Wait for a shot she could be certain of, rather than one she was merely confident about. And then Brennan's voice crackled over her radio, shattering the desert silence like broken glass. And suddenly, none of it mattered anymore. All stations, this is Viper 2-3, emergency beacon activation. Grid 327498, snakebite, urgent. I say again, snakebite, urgent. Kira's blood turned to ice water despite the desert heat. She checked her map with hands that suddenly wanted to shake, calculating distance and time with the same mathematical precision she brought to ballistics. Grid 327498 was 3.2 kilometers away, across broken terrain studded with rocks and obstacles. The voice came again, and this time she could hear the strain in it, the edge of panic that no amount of training could completely suppress when you were dying alone in the desert. This is Viper 2-3. I'm hit. Rattlesnake. Right forearm. I'm having trouble breathing. Need immediate medevac. She recognized the voice. Colt Brennan, the man who'd been sabotaging her equipment, the man who'd challenged her and tested her and made her prove herself every single day. Now dying from venom coursing through his bloodstream, his respiratory system starting to shut down as the neurotoxins did their work. 3.2 kilometers, with 40 pounds of gear and a rifle, in 112-degree heat across terrain that was nothing but rocks and sand and obstacles designed to break ankles and slow movement. 90 minutes at best if she pushed hard and didn't break something. Rattlesnake venom could kill in 2 hours, sometimes less depending on the species and how much venom was injected and where the bite landed. She looked through her scope at the target. One shot and she'd complete the exercise. Pass this evolution. Move on to the next phase of training. Prove she belonged here, that she could handle the pressure and perform under conditions designed to break people. Or she could break protocol, use her emergency radio for something that might not technically be life-threatening, according to the medical standards, abandon her mission and go help a man who'd spent 3 weeks making her life difficult. The choice should have been hard, should have required deliberation and calculation and weighing of consequences. But Kira found that it wasn't hard at all, because her father had already taught her the answer, even though he'd been dead for 26 years, and she'd never heard him speak a word. Precision is patient. Precision is knowing what matters and what doesn't. Precision is understanding that some things are more important than passing tests, or proving yourself, or completing missions. She keyed her radio, breaking the seal, ending her exercise with a single transmission. Viper 23, this is Ashford. I'm breaking protocol. Medical emergency. Grid 327498. En route to your position. ETA 90 mics. The instructor's voice came back immediately, cold and professional, delivering the verdict she already knew. Ashford, be advised. Breaking protocol means automatic disqualification from this evolution. Copy that, Kira said, already moving, already shedding unnecessary gear to move faster, her voice steady despite knowing she was throwing away 3 weeks of work with a single decision. Don't care. Viper 23 is getting anti-venom. Ashford out. She covered the 3.2 kilometers in 83 minutes, pushing through heat and exhaustion, and the voice in her head that kept calculating how far behind she was falling, how completely she'd just failed the test she'd spent weeks preparing for. Her lungs burned, her legs screamed, sweat poured off her body in quantities that would have been dangerous if she hadn't been drinking water continuously, pushing her hydration system to its limits. She found Brennan in a shallow depression between two rocks, and the sight of him hit her like a physical blow. His face was the gray color of concrete, lips going blue from oxygen deprivation as the venom affected his respiratory system. His right forearm was twice its normal size, the skin stretched tight and shiny, purple-black discoloration spreading from the fang marks just above his wrist. Kira didn't waste time talking or asking questions or doing anything except what needed to be done. She went to work with the efficiency of someone who'd trained for this exact scenario, who'd run through medical emergencies until the responses were automatic, until her hands knew what to do, even when her mind was screaming about heat and exhaustion and the magnitude of what she just sacrificed. Tourniquet above the elbow, tight enough to slow circulation, but not stop it completely. Cutting off blood flow entirely would cause tissue death and possibly cost him the arm. Inject the anti-venom from her medical kit, one dose that she prayed would be enough, that would give his body the tools it needed to fight the venom spreading through his system. Field dressing over the wound site to keep it clean and protected. Elevate the arm to slow the spread. Check his airway, still breathing but labored, the venom starting to affect his diaphragm, his respiratory muscles struggling against the neurotoxins. You failed the test for me, Brennan whispered, his voice barely audible, his eyes struggling to focus on her face. Shut up and conserve energy, Kira said, not looking up from her work, her hands steady despite everything. Helicopters inbound. You're going to be fine. Just keep breathing. The MH-60 arrived 13 minutes later. The distinctive whump, whump, whump of rotor blades cutting through desert silence. Rotor wash blasting sand in every direction and creating a miniature sandstorm that scoured exposed skin. The para-rescue team loaded Brennan onto a litter with practiced efficiency, started an IV to push fluids and support his blood pressure, hooked him to monitors that beeped and displayed vital signs that were concerning but not critical, that suggested he'd live if they got him to proper medical care soon enough. As they loaded him aboard the helicopter, Brennan grabbed Kira's wrist with his good hand, his grip surprisingly strong for someone who'd just been fighting for his life, who'd been minutes away from respiratory failure. Ashford, he managed, forcing the words past lips that didn't want to work properly. Save it, she said, gently extracting her wrist from his grip. Just don't die. That's an order, petty officer. The helicopter lifted off, and Kira stood in the desert silence, covered in dust and sweat and Brennan's blood, her gear scattered around her position where she dropped it to move faster. She'd failed the exercise, disqualified. 3 weeks of hell, 3 weeks of proving herself and adapting and surviving, and she'd thrown it all away for a man who'd been actively working against her. She pulled out her water bottle, took one small sip, hydration discipline even now, even in the aftermath of crisis, and started the long walk back to the rally point, her mind already moving forward, already accepting the consequences of her choice, and understanding that she'd do it again without hesitation, because some things mattered more than passing tests. The walk took 6 hours. 6 hours alone in the desert, with nothing but her thoughts, and the understanding that she'd just made the most important decision of her training, even if it meant she'd failed. Commander Harlan was waiting when she arrived at 0200 hours, 18 hours after the medevac, 18 hours of walking and thinking and coming to terms with what she'd done. The Tactical Operations Center was empty except for him, lit only by the glow of computer screens showing terrain maps and exercise data, the artificial light harsh after hours in natural darkness. "Captain Ashford," he said as she entered, and his voice gave nothing away. "Sir," she came to attention, filthy and exhausted and ready for whatever came next, ready to accept the consequences of her choice without complaint or excuse. "You failed the Desert Stalk exercise." "Yes, sir. You broke protocol. Used the emergency radio for what medical later determined was a non-life-threatening situation. Petty Officer Brennan had a mild envenomation. He would have survived until the scheduled pickup 12 hours later." Kira's jaw tightened, but she kept her voice steady and professional. "Sir, respectfully, a rattlesnake bite is life-threatening until proven otherwise. Medical said he would have survived, but they said it with the benefit of hindsight and hospital care. In the field, with the information I had, he could have gone into anaphylactic shock. He could have had a severe reaction. His breathing was already compromised. I wasn't willing to gamble with his life based on probabilities." Harlan was quiet for a long moment, studying her with eyes that had seen too much and remembered all of it, that carried the weight of decisions made and consequences lived with. Finally, he opened a folder on his desk. "Your after-action report says you located Target 3 at 1,443 meters. Had a clear shot. Chose not to take it because conditions were suboptimal." "Yes, sir. Wind was gusting between 15 and 18 knots. Mirage was severe. Shot probability was maybe 60%, maybe a little better if I timed the wind perfectly." "So you waited for better conditions even though taking the shot would have completed your exercise?" "Yes, sir. Even though Petty Officer Brennan was also moving toward the same target and would have engaged if you didn't." Kira said nothing. There was nothing to say that wouldn't sound like excuse-making or justification. Harlan closed the folder, stood, and walked to the window overlooking the ranges where dawn was starting to break over the ocean, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold that promised another brutally hot day. "Petty Officer Brennan is going to make a full recovery," he said quietly, his back still to her. "He'll be out of the program for 2 weeks on medical hold, but he'll be back. They're keeping him for observation, making sure there are no delayed reactions, but the prognosis is good. He asked me to give you a message." "Sir?" Harlan turned to face her, and there was something in his expression she'd never seen before, something that might have been respect or understanding or the first crack in the armor he'd been wearing for 26 years. "He said to tell you, best shot I ever saw someone not take." Despite everything, the exhaustion, the failure, the crushing disappointment of throwing away 3 weeks of work, Kira almost smiled. "This program isn't about shooting, Ashford," Harlan said, and his voice carried weight that went beyond words, beyond military instruction, reaching into something more fundamental about what it meant to be a warrior. "Any idiot can learn to pull a trigger. We can teach that in a few weeks. We're training you to know when to pull the trigger and when not to. When the shot matters and when it doesn't. When mission success is more important than individual achievement. When saving your teammate's life is more important than passing an exercise or proving yourself or completing an objective." He picked up a small box from his desk and handed it to her. Inside, wrapped in tissue paper that rustled with her trembling hands, was a silver insignia. the SEAL trident. Eagle, anchor, pistol, and trident combined into a symbol that represented something beyond military service. Something that spoke to brotherhood and sacrifice, and the kind of bond that only formed between people who trusted each other with their lives in the worst places on earth. "You're not a SEAL," Harlan said quietly, and there was no judgment in his voice, only statement of fact. "You're a Marine, and this doesn't make you one. But this is a token from the men in this compound. You earn their respect, Ashford. Not because you're a great shooter, though you are. Not because you can hang with them physically, though you've proven you can. Because you made the hard call when nobody was watching and no one would have blamed you for taking the easy path. Because you understood what mattered." Kira stared at the trident, her throat suddenly tight with emotion she hadn't let herself feel during the long walk back, during the hours of accepting what she thought was failure. "Sir, I don't understand. I failed the exercise. I broke protocol. I didn't complete the mission." "The exercise you failed was never about the targets, Captain," Harlan said, and now she could see moisture in his eyes, could see the weight of 26 years starting to lift from his shoulders. "It was about judgment under pressure, about making the decision that serves something larger than yourself when faced with a choice between personal success and someone else's life. Your father made that exact same choice in Mogadishu. October 3rd, during the battle, he gave up his covered position to help extract a pinned Ranger squad. That decision exposed him, put him in a less defensible position, made him vulnerable, and it led directly to him being in position for the mission on October 4th that got him killed." Harlan moved closer, and Kira could see tears tracking down his weathered cheeks now, cutting through decades of suppressed grief. He chose to save those Rangers, knowing it might cost him later. And it did. It cost him everything. But he made that choice anyway, without hesitation, because that's what warriors do. That's what separates operators from shooters, service from skill. You understand what matters, and you just prove you're exactly like him in all the ways that count. His voice dropped even lower, becoming almost intimate in its honesty, which terrifies me more than I can possibly express, because I know where that path leads. I watched it lead your father to a street in Mogadishu where American bullets tore through his position and took him away from everyone who loved him. And I've spent 26 years wondering if I could have stopped him, if I could have made him choose differently, if I could have saved him the way he saved me. He took a breath, steadied himself with visible effort. "Report to Building 7 at 0600 hours. You're approved for the SEAL Precision Record attempt. 3,200 meters. You've got 2 weeks to prepare. And Ashford, sir, your father would be proud. Not because you can shoot better than almost anyone I've ever seen, because you understand what the shooting is for, because you know that precision without purpose is just mathematics, and mathematics without heart is just numbers that don't mean anything." After he left, Kira sat alone in the operations center, holding the trident insignia in hands that trembled with exhaustion and emotion she'd been suppressing for weeks. She let herself cry for the first time since her mother's death 2 years ago. Let the tears come for her father, who'd made the same choice she just made and paid for it with his life. For Harlan, who'd carried guilt for 26 years. For herself and the weight of understanding that came with knowing you'd made the right choice even when it cost you everything you'd worked for. She finally understood what her father had meant when he wrote that precision is patient. It wasn't about shooting at all. It was about understanding what mattered and what didn't. About knowing that some choices defined you more than any achievement or record or recognition. About recognizing that the hardest shots were the ones you refused to take. The moments when you said no despite pressure or expectation, because taking that shot would violate something more important than success. That night, she wrote in her journal, the words coming slow and careful. Target 3. Did not engage. Conditions suboptimal. Mission priorities shifted when Brennan was hit. Lesson learned. The longest shots are the ones you carry inside. The weight of choosing right over easy. The burden of understanding that some things matter more than completing the mission, or passing the test, or proving yourself to skeptics. My father knew this. Now I know it too. Precision is patient, and patience, I'm beginning to understand, is the greatest precision of all. 2 weeks later, she would stand at the firing line at Coronado and attempt to break a record her father had secretly held for 26 years. But the real test, the one that actually mattered, the one that separated warriors from shooters, she'd already passed in the desert when nobody was watching except her own conscience and the ghost of a man she'd never met but was finally beginning to understand. The weight of precision, the burden of legacy, the impossible mathematics of being your father's daughter while trying to forge your own path forward, to honor what he'd done while becoming who you needed to be. This was the crucible, and Kira Ashford had walked through the fire and emerged not broken, but tempered into something stronger than she'd been before, transformed by understanding into someone worthy of carrying her father's name and legacy forward. The record attempt was just the final proof, the public demonstration of what she'd already proven in private. The desert had been the real test all along. The 2 weeks between Kira's approval for the record attempt and the actual day felt like standing on the edge of a cliff, looking down into empty air, knowing that the only way forward was to jump and trust that everything she'd learned would be enough to carry her across the impossible distance between here and there, between who she'd been and who she needed to become. Every morning at 0530 hours, she reported to Range Complex 7, the long-distance facility that stretched across 3 miles of Coronado scrubland, like a ruler measuring the limits of human capability, the boundaries of what was possible when skill and determination and understanding all converged on a single point. Each morning she assembled it, verified 0 at shorter distances to ensure the scope was properly aligned, broke it down again, building muscle memory until the weapon felt like part of her skeleton, until she could manipulate it, blindfolded in complete darkness, and still know exactly where every component belonged and how it needed to move. 3,200 meters. That number lived in her head like a mantra, like a prayer, like a mathematical proof she needed to solve, using variables that kept changing and equations that had no simple answers. 1.988 miles, 10,560 feet, 126,720 inches. 2 football fields beyond the current official SEAL record, a distance that seemed to mock human capability, that suggested hubris in even attempting it. At that distance, the bullet would be in flight for 3.8 seconds, nearly 4 full seconds between trigger press and impact. 4 seconds during which 1,000 things could go wrong, during which the wind could shift or gust, during which the target could move if it were human, during which the earth itself would rotate beneath the bullet's path. The mathematics were staggering, almost offensive in their complexity. Bullet drop at 3,200 meters with a 650-grain Raufoss projectile would be 182 inches. That was more than 15 feet, the height of a small building. She had to aim 15 feet above the target just to compensate for gravity's inexorable pull on the bullet as it traveled nearly 2 miles through the air. Wind drift at a steady 10-mile-per-hour crosswind would be 368 inches. That was over 30 feet to the side, the width of a house. But wind was never steady, never simple, never cooperative. Wind at ground level might be 10 miles per hour, while wind at 15 feet, where the bullet spent most of its flight, might be 12 or 8 or 15. Wind at 1,000 meters downrange might be completely different from wind at 2,000 meters. She had to read the entire column of air between her position and the target, 3,200 meters of atmosphere that was constantly shifting and changing, and understand what it was doing at every point along the bullet's path. Day 1 of preparation, she shot at 2,000 meters. 10 rounds, 6 hits, 4 misses that taught her more than the successes. She recorded every detail with obsessive precision. Wind conditions at her position and downrange, temperature and how it changed throughout the day, humidity levels, barometric pressure, mirage intensity, time of day and angle of sun, how all these variables interacted and influenced each other. Built a database in her mind of what worked and what didn't, what conditions produced good results and which ones fought against accuracy. Day 3 brought 2,200 meters, 8 rounds, 5 hits. She was learning the rifle's personality, discovering how this specific weapon behaved differently from theoretical calculations, how this particular barrel had its own characteristics that couldn't be predicted from ballistic tables, its own preferences for certain loads and certain conditions. Day 5 pushed to 2,400 meters, 10 rounds, 4 hits. The conditions were poor that day, deliberately chosen to test her ability to shoot in adversity. Wind gusting to 18 miles per hour, shifting directions unpredictably. Mirage severe, making the target dance and shimmer like something that wasn't quite real. Temperature climbing through 90 degrees, creating thermal currents that complicated everything. She shot anyway, because combat wouldn't wait for perfect conditions. Because the real test would come when everything was wrong, and she needed to perform regardless. By day 9, she was attempting 2,800 meters, her father's Mogadishu distance, the number that had been classified for 26 years. 10 rounds, 2 hits. 2 out of 10 meant an 80% failure rate. The statistics were working against her now, the variables stacking up until precision became more about probability than certainty, more about luck than skill. Commander Harlan watched from the observation post every day, his weathered face unreadable behind binoculars, never offering advice or correction, just watching and recording and letting her figure it out on her own. It was a teaching method that bordered on cruel, but Kira understood the logic behind it. He was forcing her to be self-sufficient, to solve problems without depending on outside input, because in the field there wouldn't be anyone to give her answers or tell her what adjustments to make. On day 10, after a particularly frustrating session where she'd missed 7 out of 10 shots at 2,800 meters, Harlan finally spoke. "You're shooting like you're trying to force the rifle to do something it doesn't want to do," he said, lowering his binoculars and walking toward her position. Kira looked up from her data book where she'd been recording another failure, surprised by the unsolicited comment. "Sir? Every shot you're fighting, muscling the rifle, trying to impose your will on physics and ballistics and wind that doesn't care what you want." Harlan set down the binoculars and moved closer, his voice taking on the tone of someone sharing hard-won wisdom. "That's not how this works at extreme range. You can't force nature to cooperate. You have to work with it, understand it, become part of it." "Then how does it work, sir?" Harlan thought for a moment, searching for the right analogy, the right way to explain something that was more art than science. "You ever fly a kite when you were a kid?" The question was so unexpected that Kira almost laughed. "When I was young, yes, sir. You remember trying to make the kite go exactly where you wanted it? Make it turn left, turn right, climb higher, dive lower, spell out your name in the sky? Didn't work very well. The kite had other ideas." "No," Harlan agreed, and there was something almost gentle in his voice now. "Because you can't force a kite. You have to work with the wind, feel what the air is doing, and use it. Guide the kite, don't command it. Let it do what it wants to do while you nudge it in the direction you need. Fighting the wind just makes the kite crash." He picked up the Barrett, hefted its weight with the ease of long familiarity. Decades of handling weapons that could kill at distances most people couldn't even see clearly. Same principle here. At 3,200 meters, you can't force the bullet to go exactly where you want. Too many variables, too much distance, too many things that can change between trigger press and impact. You have to read what the environment is giving you and use it. Find the moment when everything aligns naturally and take the shot then. Not before when you're trying to make the conditions right. Not after when the moment has passed. Exactly then, in that perfect instant when the universe cooperates. That's what I've been trying to do, sir. No, Harlan shook his head, handing the rifle back to her. You've been trying to create the perfect moment through force of will and calculation. You need to wait for it to arrive on its own. There's a difference. A big one. He paused and his voice took on a distant quality, like he was seeing something beyond the present moment. Your father understood this better than anyone I've ever known. He'd wait for hours sometimes, just watching, breathing, becoming part of the landscape. Wouldn't move, wouldn't fidget, wouldn't get impatient. Just watched and waited until the conditions told him it was time. He didn't chase the shot, he let the shot come to him. That's what made him great. That's what kept him alive through missions that should have killed him, right up until the one that finally did. Kira felt something shift in her understanding, some piece of the puzzle clicking into place. How long did you work with my father, sir? 18 months. Best 18 months of my career, even knowing how it ended. Harlan's voice carried the weight of memory and loss. We ran missions out of Mogadishu for 6 months before everything went wrong in October. And in that time, he taught me more about patience and precision than I'd learned in the previous 10 years of service. He had this way of reading the environment that seemed almost supernatural. Could look at grass bending or dust moving, or the way heat shimmer danced across the desert and tell you exactly what the wind was doing at every point between him and whatever he was shooting at. What was he really like? The question came out before Kira could stop it, raw and vulnerable in a way that broke through her professional composure. Harlan looked at her for a long moment, measuring how much truth she could handle, how much she needed to hear. He was the most patient man I ever met. Could sit in a hide for 12 hours without moving, barely breathing, just watching and waiting like he had all the time in the world. And he had this gift for reading people's patterns, understanding how they moved and thought and what they'd do next. Made him incredibly dangerous as a sniper because he could predict where targets would be before they knew themselves. He paused, searching for the right words. But what made him truly exceptional wasn't his shooting ability. It was his judgment. He understood that pulling the trigger was the last resort, not the first option. Would spend days on reconnaissance, learning patterns, finding angles, looking for ways to accomplish the mission without ever firing a shot. And when he did shoot, when he finally decided the moment was right, it was because every other option had been exhausted, and this was the only way forward. The shot was never about ego or proving himself. It was always about the mission, about protecting people, about doing what needed to be done for the right reasons. Harlan's voice went even quieter. October 3rd, during the Black Hawk Down battle, your father had multiple opportunities to shoot targets of opportunity, to pad his kill count, to make shots that would have looked impressive on a report. But he didn't. Only engaged when our people were in immediate danger, when every shot directly saved an American life. Made 18 kills that day, but could have made 50 if it was about numbers. It wasn't. It was about purpose. And that's what I need you to understand before you attempt this record. The shooting isn't the point. The purpose is. That night, Kira thought about her father waiting 12 hours for a single shot, about the kind of patience that required, the kind of discipline and clarity of purpose. She thought about the difference between forcing outcomes and letting them arrive naturally, between fighting against circumstances and working with them. She thought about precision as philosophy rather than technique, about shooting as expression of values rather than demonstration of skill. And for the first time, she felt ready. The morning of the record attempt arrived with fog rolling off the Pacific Ocean, thick enough to taste salt in the air, thick enough to delay the start by 2 hours while it burned off under the climbing sun. By 0800 hours, the fog had dissipated, leaving behind perfect clarity that felt almost like a gift. Temperature 64 degrees and climbing steadily. Wind 8 to 12 miles per hour, variable from the west. Humidity 71%. Barometric pressure, 30.12 inches of mercury. Conditions that fell within acceptable parameters for extreme long-range shooting, though far from perfect. Perfect didn't exist in the real world. Perfect was a theoretical construct, something you could model on a computer, but never actually encounter in the field, where 1,000 variables constantly shifted and changed. Kira stood at the equipment table, methodically checking her gear with the same ritual precision she'd developed over thousands of repetitions. Barrett M82A1, serial number engraved into the receiver, like a promise of what this weapon could do in the right hands. Schmidt and Bender, 5 to 45 power scope, mounted and zeroed with obsessive care. 3 Ralphus MK2-11 rounds, each one a masterpiece of precision manufacturing, each one loaded with 650 grains of carefully shaped projectile designed to maintain stability across impossible distances. The target waited 3,200 meters away, barely visible to the naked eye even in perfect clarity. Steel silhouette, 40 inches tall, 20 inches wide, painted safety orange against the brown hillside to make it theoretically visible through a scope at maximum magnification. 47 SEAL snipers stood in formation behind the firing line, their presence both witness and judgment. Pentagon observers with clipboards and cameras. Brass from Naval Special Warfare Command, wearing uniforms heavy with ribbons and rank insignia. Media with controlled access, their cameras pointed at the range like weapons, waiting to record either triumph or failure, either history being made or hubris being punished. And standing off to one side, talking quietly with the range officer, was Lieutenant Garrett Wade. Kira hadn't known he was coming, hadn't been prepared for the added pressure of competition with one of the best precision shooters in the American military. Wade was 33 years old, 6'2", with a kind of compact, efficient build that suggested strength held in reserve rather than displayed. Blonde hair cut military regulations short, blue eyes that had seen combat across multiple deployments, that carried the weight of decisions made and lives taken. He had a slight Texas drawl that made every word sound casual, even when discussing life and death. A vocal pattern that suggested confidence without arrogance. He was also the holder of the U.S. Army long-range record, 3,150 meters, confirmed kill made in Afghanistan under combat conditions, not on a range with known distance and controlled environment, but in the chaos of actual warfare where everything mattered and mistakes cost lives. 142 confirmed kills total across multiple deployments, 2 Bronze Stars for valor under fire, and a reputation as someone who could make impossible shots look routine. He saw Kira looking and walked over with the easy confidence of someone comfortable in his own skin, someone who didn't need to prove anything to anyone, but still enjoyed the competition. Hand extended, smile genuine. Captain Ashford, mind if I make an attempt too? Pentagon thought it would be good optics. Army versus Navy, inter-service rivalry, that kind of publicity nonsense. Kira shook his hand, feeling the calluses that matched her own, the marks of someone who'd spent years handling weapons and gear. Lieutenant Wade, I understand you shot perfect at the joint sniper competition last year. Luck and good conditions, Wade said with a self-deprecating smile that suggested he didn't actually believe that, but was too polite to brag. I've seen your damn neck scores, though. You're the real deal. That perfect 10 for 10 with moving targets in a crosswind. That's world-class shooting. Thank you, sir. Wade's expression sobered slightly, taking on a more serious cast. For what it's worth, I think the media circus around this is bullshit. This should be about the skill and the precision and pushing the boundaries of what's possible, not about gender or service rivalry or any of the political nonsense. You make this shot, you earned it fair and square, period. Kira appreciated the sentiment, appreciated the straightforward honesty that cut through all the noise in politics. Agreed, sir. That said, Wade continued, his smile returning with a competitive edge, I'm still going to try my hardest to beat you. Nothing personal, just professional pride. I wouldn't expect anything less, sir. Wade glanced at the target, barely visible as an orange dot in the distance. You know what I've found is the hardest part at this range? The wind variability? The waiting, Wade said, and there was wisdom in his voice, the kind that only came from experience and hard lessons learned. Conditions change every 30 seconds out there. Wind shifts, temperature fluctuates, mirage builds and dissipates. You get maybe a 2-minute window when everything aligns properly, when all the variables stabilize enough to give you a real shot. Miss that window, try to force it when conditions aren't right, and you're shooting into chaos. The discipline to recognize the moment and wait for it instead of rushing, that's what separates the truly great shooters from the merely good ones. Kira nodded slowly, understanding that Wade was offering genuine advice without holding anything back, sharing wisdom that had cost him time and ammunition and missed shots to learn. I appreciate that perspective, sir. Good luck, Captain. May the best shooter win. And may we both push each other to be better than we'd be alone. Commander Harlan's voice cut across the range, amplified and official. All personnel, take positions. We're beginning in 5 minutes. The protocol was simple and brutal in its fairness. 3 shooters, Garrett Wade representing the Army, Kira Ashford representing the Marines in this new program, and Commander Harlan himself representing the old guard and the history of the teams. Each shooter got 3 attempts. Best single shot won. Wade would shoot first as the visiting service representative, then Kira, then Harlan. Wade stepped to the firing line with his rifle, a Shytac M200 intervention chambered in .408 Shytac, a purpose-built extreme long-range weapon that cost more than most people's cars and represented the bleeding edge of precision rifle technology. He had every advantage technology could provide. Deliberate, not just quiet, silent in a way that felt almost sacred, like the moment before a prayer or the instant before a symphony begins. Dozens of people collectively holding their breath, waiting to see what was possible when skill and preparation and technology all converged on a single point nearly 2 miles away. Wind 8 knots from 270, Wade's spotter called quietly. Pressure steady at 0.12. Wade adjusted his scope with tiny, precise clicks. Breathed slowly, deliberately, controlling his heart rate and body position. Waited for the moment to arrive, for all the variables to align in that brief window where the shot became possible. Rather, 3.8 seconds of silence followed, time stretching like taffy, like the moment between heartbeats when the world holds still. Then the 19.4 minutes of preparation this time, less setup required now that he understood how the conditions were actually behaving versus how they'd appeared on his instruments. He fired again. 3.8 seconds of breathless silence. Impact 4 inches high, 3 inches left. Distance from center, 5.0 inches. The applause was louder this time, more enthusiastic. 5 inches, and when he fired, Kira could see the absolute concentration on his face, the complete stillness of his body, the way he'd become part of the rifle rather than simply holding it. 3.8 seconds that felt like hours. Impact 2.3 inches low, 1.1 inches right. Distance from center, 2.54 inches. The crowd erupted. Standing ovation, SEALs and officers and observers on their feet applauding. Wade had just set a new SEAL range record with a shot that defied statistical probability, that represented the pinnacle of what was possible when human skill met perfect conditions and everything cooperated for exactly the right 3.8 seconds. Wade stood, cleared his rifle with practiced motions, shook hands with his spotter, professional, humble, carrying himself with the quiet dignity of someone who understood the magnitude of what he'd just accomplished, but didn't need to celebrate it publicly. Then he looked at Kira, and the message in his eyes was clear and simple. Your turn. Beat that if you can. Kira walked to the firing line, feeling the weight of every eye on her, feeling the pressure of expectations and doubt and curiosity all focused on this small woman attempting to do something that seemed to defy physical possibility. Colt Brennan appeared at her side, arms still bandaged from the snake bite, though he'd been cleared to return to light duty. "I'm your spotter if you'll have me, Captain." She looked at him, saw the sincerity in his eyes, saw the respect that had replaced skepticism and doubt. "You sure about this, petty officer? Your arm is fine," Brennan interrupted, "and I'm not going to miss watching you make history. You saved my life in that desert. Least I can do is help you honor your father's memory. Besides," he added with a slight smile, "I want to see if you're as good as you think you are." "I don't think I'm good, petty officer," Kira said, settling behind the Barrett with fluid economy of movement. "I know I'm competent. There's a difference." Brennan grinned. "That's the most Marine answer I've ever heard. Let's shoot." Kira loaded the first massive Ralphus round, the cartridge clicking into the chamber with satisfying precision. The rifle settled into her shoulder like it belonged there, like it had been designed specifically for her hands, despite being built for operators twice her size. She'd made peace with the weapon over 2 weeks of constant practice, had learned its personality and preferences and quirks. "Wind 9 knots from 275, Brennan called quietly. "Temperature 72. You've got good conditions, clean air. Send it when you're ready." But Kira wasn't ready. Not yet. Because ready wasn't about conditions or calculations. Ready was about understanding the moment, about letting the shot come to her rather than chasing it. Ready was about patience. She closed her eyes, shutting out the visual noise, focusing on other senses. Felt the wind on her face, gentle, invariable. Felt the warmth of the sun on her neck, the heat building as morning progressed toward midday. Felt the weight of 3 generations of warriors settling onto her shoulders, like an invisible burden that had been building since her great-grandfather carried a rifle across Pacific beaches, since her grandfather made impossible shots in Korean mountains, since her father took his last breath in a Mogadishu street 26 years ago. She opened her eyes and looked through the scope. The target was barely visible, even at maximum magnification, a blurred orange rectangle dancing in the heat shimmer that had already begun to build. She began her calculations not as conscious mathematics, but as intuitive understanding built from 10,000 repetitions. Wind drift, bullet drop, Coriolis effect from Earth's rotation, spin drift from the bullet's stabilizing rotation, temperature gradient affecting air density, humidity changing how the air resisted the bullet's passage, all of it flowing through her mind like water finding its path, like music following its natural rhythm. Behind her, she heard Commander Harlan's voice, quiet enough that only she could hear it over the whisper of wind and the ambient sounds of the range. "Your father's last words were, 'Precision is patient,'" he said softly. "Now you know what he meant. Now you understand." Kira took a breath. 4 seconds in, 4 seconds hold, 4 seconds out. Her heart rate dropped to 54 beats per minute, the trained response of someone who'd learned to control her autonomic nervous system through thousands of hours of practice. The world narrowed to the scope picture, to the tiny orange rectangle swimming in magnified distance. Between heartbeats, in that fraction of a second when her body was completely still and her mind was clear and focused, she began to squeeze the trigger. The Barrett roared. The buttstock hammered into her shoulder with familiar force. The rifle recoiled back, cycling the action, ejecting the spent brass in a smoking arc that glittered in the California sun. 3.8 seconds. The world held its breath. "Impact 8 inches high, 5 inches right," the range officer called. "Distance from center, 9.4 inches. Not good enough." Kira had missed Wade's best shot by nearly 7 inches, a gap that felt enormous at this distance. The crowd murmured, disappointed but not surprised. She'd made a respectable attempt, proved she belonged in the conversation, but respectable wasn't record-breaking. Brennan leaned close, his voice low and supportive. Wind gusted right as you fired. 12 miles per hour for about half a second. That's what pushed you high right. Not your fault, just bad timing. But it was her fault, because she should have waited for the gust to pass. Should have felt it building and held her shot for another heartbeat. She'd rushed, let the pressure override her training, force the moment instead of waiting for it. Adjust down 2.3 minutes, she said quietly, her voice steady despite the disappointment. Left 1.5. Brennan dialed the corrections into the scope with practiced precision. Set. You've got 2 rounds left. Make them count. Kira loaded the second round, settled back into position. This time she waited, watching the wind flags downrange, feeling the air currents, looking for the pattern Wade had mentioned. Wind wasn't random. Nothing in nature was truly random if you watched long enough to understand the patterns, to see the rhythm beneath the apparent chaos. There, she could see it now. 8 miles per hour from 280, steady for about 90 seconds. Then dropping to 6 for 30 seconds. Then building back to 10. A cycle that repeated every 3 minutes like clockwork, like the breathing of some vast organism. She waited for the low point, for that 30-second window when the wind dropped to 6 miles per hour and held steady, when the flags barely moved and the mirage settled and everything aligned in temporary perfection. Squeezed. 3.8 seconds of waiting, of hoping, of trusting her calculations and her understanding. Impact 1.8 inches low, 2.1 inches left. Distance from center 2.77 inches. Closer, much closer. The crowd's excitement built, sensing possibility, sensing that they might witness something extraordinary. But still 0.2 of an inch worse than Wade's best shot. Still not quite good enough to claim the record. Kira had 1 shot left. 1 round to be 2.54 inches. 1 chance to break the record and force the Pentagon to acknowledge what her father had accomplished 26 years ago. 1 opportunity to prove that his sacrifice and his skill and his understanding hadn't been forgotten or buried or classified into irrelevance. The pressure should have been crushing, should have made her hands shake and her breathing shallow and her mind race with what-ifs and possibilities. Instead, she felt calm settling over her like a blanket, like the stillness before a storm, like the moment between heartbeats when everything aligns and becomes clear. She looked at the chronometer on her wrist. 0921. 3 minutes until the wind cycle repeated, until conditions matched Wade's best shot. But there was more to it than simple repetition of conditions. There was something Wade couldn't have known, something nobody had ever considered, because it had never mattered before. Brennan, she said quietly, what time did Wade make his best shot? Brennan checked his notes without question. 0854. Why? What were the exact conditions? Temperature 69, wind 10 miles per hour from 285, steady. Why? What are you thinking? Kira smiled, understanding clicking into place like an equation solving itself, like all the variables finally aligning in her mind. Wade had hit the perfect moment in the thermal cycle, when the ocean breeze stabilized as the sun heated the ground and created predictable convection patterns. That cycle repeated every 24 minutes. She'd observed it over 2 weeks of shooting at this range, had documented it in her notebook without fully understanding its significance until this exact moment. Wade shot at 0854. The next stabilization would occur at 0924. But there was another variable, something subtle and easy to miss unless you were looking for it specifically. Height differential. Wade was 6'2". His eye level when prone was 69 inches above the ground. Kira was 5'2". Her eye level was 60 inches above the ground. That 9-inch difference changed the shooting angle by 0.18 minutes of angle. At 3,200 meters, that tiny angular difference translated to a 6-inch vertical difference in impact. Wade's ballistic solution was perfect for his height, for his eye level, for his specific geometry relative to the target. but not for hers. She needed to aim slightly lower, compensate for the fact that her sight line to the target was at a different angle than his had been. Just zero point 0.3 minutes of angle. A tiny adjustment that nobody in SEAL history had ever considered because they'd never had a shooter this much shorter than the average attempting shots at this distance. "Brennan," she said, her voice carrying absolute certainty, "we wait 3 minutes." "Ashford, what? We're burning time. Every second you wait, the conditions could change. The opportunity could—" "Trust me," Kira interrupted, and there was something in her voice that stopped his protest. "My father taught me to wait for certainty, not settle for probability. 3 minutes." Brennan stared at her for a moment, recognizing something in her expression, some quality of absolute conviction. Then slowly, he nodded. "Your call. I hope you know what you're doing." "I do. Finally, after 27 years, I understand exactly what I'm doing." Kira adjusted her scope down 0.3 minutes, the tiny click of the adjustment knob loud in the relative silence. Compensating for the height differential that Wade had never needed to account for. Then she waited, watching the chronometer tick toward 0924, watching the wind flags, feeling the air stabilize as the thermal cycle completed its rotation and began again. 0923, 30 seconds. The wind flags went steady, settling into the same pattern Wade had shot in. 10 miles per hour from 285 degrees. Temperature 73, just a few degrees warmer than Wade's shot, but within the margin her calculations could accommodate. Conditions identical to Wade's best attempt, but with the thermal equilibrium that made them more stable, more predictable, more certain. 0924. This was the moment. Not forced, not rushed, but arrived at naturally through understanding and patience and waiting for the universe to cooperate. This was what her father had meant about precision being patient. This was why he'd waited hours for single shots, why he'd valued timing over speed, certainty over probability. Kira settled behind the rifle one final time, her body moving through familiar motions with practiced efficiency. This wasn't about beating Wade, though she respected his skill and appreciated the challenge he represented. This wasn't about proving anything to the skeptics or the SEALs or the Pentagon or the media watching with their cameras and their narratives. This was about honoring a legacy by understanding it, about making a shot that mattered for the right reasons at the right time, about demonstrating that precision wasn't just about technical skill, but about judgment and patience, and knowing when the moment was right versus when you were forcing something that wasn't ready. She thought about her father waiting 6 hours in Mogadishu for the perfect shot, about him understanding that some shots you take and some you refuse, and knowing the difference is what makes you a warrior. She thought about Harlan carrying 26 years of guilt for surviving when his partner hadn't. She thought about the 12 men her father had saved with a shot that cost him his life, about the families who got to stay whole because one man understood his purpose clearly enough to die for it. This shot was for all of them, for her father who died making the last, best shot of his life, for Harlan who'd carried the secret too long, for the 12 saved lives who deserved to know the name of the man who'd given them their futures, for everyone who'd ever understood that precision without purpose was just mathematics. She breathed. 4 in, 4 hold, 4 out. Heart rate dropped to 52 beats per minute. The world narrowed to the scope picture, to the tiny orange rectangle that represented the target, to the crosshairs that she held steady despite the weight of everything this shot meant. Between heartbeats, in that fraction of a second when her body was completely motionless and the wind was steady and all the mathematics aligned with the universe itself, she squeezed the trigger. The Barrett roared for the last time. The buttstock hammered into her shoulder with familiar violence. The muzzle brake redirected gases in twin jets of pressure that kicked up dust in precise patterns on either side of the rifle. 3.8 seconds. The world held its breath. Time stretched. Every person on that range, from the SEALs who doubted her to the brass who'd come to witness history, to the media who'd come looking for a story, all of them waited in perfect silence for the sensor to register impact or miss. The sensor beeped. Impact. The range officer's voice was stunned, disbelieving, struggling to process what his instruments were telling him. Impact 0.87 inches from center. Silence. Absolute silence as brains processed a number that seemed impossible, that defied not just expectations, but understanding of what human beings could achieve at this distance. 0.87 inches. Less than an inch from dead center at nearly 2 miles. A shot that represented not just skill, but something approaching perfection. Something that happened maybe once in a lifetime, if you were lucky and skilled, and every single variable in the universe decided to cooperate for exactly 3.8 seconds. Then the range exploded. 47 SEAL snipers roaring their approval, voices carrying across the California scrubland like thunder. Pentagon brass on their feet, applauding with genuine enthusiasm. Media cameras swinging toward Kira like she'd just done something that would be studied and discussed and replayed for years. Garrett Wade sprinted across the range, his face split in a grin of pure admiration and delight. Hand extended, eyes shining with the kind of respect one master craftsman shows another when witnessing true excellence. "That was the finest shooting I have ever witnessed in my entire life," he said, gripping her hand with both of his. "How in God's name did you do it? What did you see that I missed?" Kira stood, cleared her rifle with hands that trembled slightly from adrenaline, despite her outward calm, made it safe with the automatic motions of thousands of repetitions. "Height differential, sir. Your ballistic solution was perfect for your eye level. I adjusted for mine. 9 inches of vertical difference changed the angle just enough to matter at this distance." Wade stared at her for a moment, processing the implications. Then he laughed, the sound genuine and filled with wonder. "You calculated angle variation based on shooter height at 3,200 meters? That's brilliant. That's advancing the science itself. I've been shooting precision rifles for 15 years, studied every variable I could think of, and I never once considered that the shooter's height would change the geometry enough to matter." He shook his head in admiration. "You didn't just beat me, Captain. You taught me something. You expanded our understanding of what variables matter at extreme range. That's worth more than any record." Commander Harlan stepped to the microphone, his voice amplified and carrying across the range with the weight of official pronouncement. "Ladies and gentlemen, new SEAL precision record, Captain Kira Ashford, 3,200 meters, 0.87 inches from center." The applause rolled like thunder across the range, but Harlan wasn't finished. He pulled a document from his pocket, and Kira could see his hands shaking as he unfolded it, could see the weight of 26 years beginning to lift from his shoulders. "There's something else you need to know," Harlan said, and his voice carried emotion barely held in check. "This morning, the Department of Defense authorized declassification of a report that has been sealed for 26 years. Operation Gothic Serpent. Mogadishu, Somalia, October 4th, 1993. The range went quiet again, sensing the significance of what was coming, understanding that this wasn't just about a record anymore, but about something deeper and more important. "Master Chief William Iron Ashford, SEAL Team 3, Harlan continued, and his voice cracked slightly on the name, made a 2,847-meter confirmed kill under combat conditions. That shot saved 12 Allied soldiers, 8 U.S. Rangers, and 4 Pakistani peacekeepers who were about to be overrun by militia forces. It remained the longest confirmed kill in naval special warfare history for 26 years. He paused, steadying himself. The shot was classified due to political considerations. Chief Ashford's shot exposed his position. 90 seconds later, he was killed by friendly fire from a U.S. helicopter door gunner who mistook his muzzle flash for enemy activity. The Pentagon buried the incident to avoid difficult questions about operational mistakes and the price we pay for fighting wars in complicated places. Harlan looked directly at Kira, and she could see tears streaming down his weathered cheeks. Until today, William Ashford held the real SEAL record, the record the Pentagon classified and buried and tried to make disappear. Captain Ashford, you didn't just break the official record, you broke your father's record, the record he died making, the record he paid for with his life. And in doing so, you've forced the truth into the light where it belongs. You've given him back his place in history. The SEALs began chanting, Ashford, Ashford, Ashford. Not mocking now, not skeptical, but honoring, recognizing, accepting. Harlan crossed to her, and in front of everyone, Pentagon brass, media, fellow warriors, the crowd of observers who'd come expecting one kind of history and witnessed something deeper, he came to attention and saluted. A commander saluting a captain. Against protocol, unprecedented, and absolutely right. Welcome to DevGru, Captain Ashford, he said, his voice thick with emotion. You've earned it beyond any question. Your father is watching, and he's so damn proud of you. Not because you broke his record, because you understood what it meant. And Admiral Kiera had never met stepped forward and pinned new rank insignia to her collar. Corporal to Petty Officer 3rd Class, promoted on the spot, the recognition coming not just for the shot, but for everything that had led to it, for every choice she'd made, and every test she'd passed, and every moment she'd chosen understanding over achievement. The crowd surrounded her with congratulations and handshakes, and words she barely processed through the roaring in her ears, and the tears streaming down her face, and the overwhelming sense of having completed something that went deeper than any record or achievement. Eventually they filtered away, returning to their duties and their lives, and Kira found herself alone at the firing line as the sun climbed higher over Coronado and painted the ranges in golden light. She pulled out her father's letter, unfolded it with hands that still trembled slightly, read his words one more time with new understanding. The longest shot isn't measured in meters or miles. It's choosing to serve knowing you might not come home. The shot they'll never record saved 12 men. Be precise in your choices, little warrior. Precision isn't in the trigger finger, it's in the heart. She finally understood, completely, totally, with a kind of clarity that only comes after walking through fire yourself and emerging transformed. Her father's 2,847-meter shot had been about saving lives, about purpose over personal safety. Her 3,200-meter shot had been about honoring his sacrifice, about forcing truth into light, about proving that his daughter had inherited not just his skill, but his understanding of what that skill was for. But the real measure of precision, the thing that actually mattered, wasn't distance or accuracy or records that could be broken. It was judgment, purpose, knowing when to take the shot and when to wait, understanding that some things mattered more than achievement or glory or proving yourself to skeptics. Tomorrow she would begin DevGru selection, 6 months of the hardest training the American military could devise, designed to forge the absolute best operators in the world. She might fail. She might succeed. But either way, she'd already proven the only thing that truly mattered. That precision wasn't just about bullets and ballistics and technical skill. It was about choices made for the right reasons, at the right time with full understanding of what they cost and what they meant. Kira Ashford stood at that firing line and finally felt at peace with the name she carried, with the legacy that had defined her life before she was old enough to understand it, with the ghost of a father she'd never met but had finally learned to know through his example. Not because she'd matched his achievement or exceeded his skill, because she'd understood his purpose. And understanding, she'd learned, was the greatest precision of all. The California sun climbed higher, warming the ranges and burning off the last traces of morning cool. The target stood unchanged at 3,200 meters, still wearing the impact mark of a bullet that had traveled nearly 2 miles and found its mark with precision measured in fractions of an inch. And somewhere in the wind, in the distance, in the impossible mathematics of what she just accomplished, Kira felt her father's presence one final time. Not as a ghost haunting her steps, or a burden weighing her down, but as a hand on her shoulder, steady and sure, telling her what he'd always known and she'd finally learned through her own journey, that some shots matter more than others, that the ones that matter most are made for the right reasons, at the right time, with full understanding of their cost. That precision without purpose is just mathematics, and mathematics without heart is just numbers on paper that don't mean anything. The Ashford legacy was complete, and it was just beginning. 3 generations of warriors had led to this moment, and now a 4th generation would carry it forward, would teach it to others, would pass on the understanding that precision is patient, and patience is the greatest precision of all. The weight of legacy, the burden of understanding, the impossible mathematics of honoring the dead while forging your own path forward, of being your father's daughter while becoming yourself. Kira Ashford had walked through fire and emerged not as a copy of her father, but as herself, carrying forward what he'd understood while adding her own understanding, building on the foundation he'd laid while creating something new. The longest shot was complete, and the journey was just beginning.